The terminal is a white dish roughly the size of a laptop screen. It sits in the mud somewhere east of the Dnieper, zip-tied to a sandbag wall, its cable snaking into a dugout where a tablet glows with drone telemetry. Overhead, a reconnaissance quadcopter is feeding coordinates to an artillery unit 3 kilometers back. The data travels not through a military radio network or a fiber optic spine that a Caliber cruise missile could sever in seconds, but through low Earth orbit, bounced off a constellation of small commercial satellites moving at roughly 28,000 kilometers per hour across the sky. Round-trip latency is under 40 milliseconds. The connection does not depend on any single relay tower that can be targeted and destroyed. That image defines one of the central and still underappreciated technological facts of the Ukraine war. From the earliest weeks of the full-scale invasion that began on February 24, 2022, SpaceX Starlink terminals became so embedded in Ukrainian military operations that senior commanders would later describe the network in terms that sound more like a vital organ than a piece of communications hardware. Understanding exactly how that happened, what Starlink changed, where it was tested, where it strained, and why the story grew complicated, is an exercise in how commercial infrastructure can rewrite military doctrine faster than doctrine writers can keep up. The architecture explains the resilience. Starlink operates a constellation of satellites in orbits ranging from roughly 340 to 570 kilometers above Earth. At that altitude, each satellite moves across the visible sky in minutes. So any ground terminal connects to whichever spacecraft is overhead, with the network handing off connections continuously. This is categorically different from traditional geostationary satellites sitting 35,000 kilometers up. Those older systems covered enormous footprints but imposed punishing latency, often half a second round trip, making real-time drone control impractical and artillery coordination sluggish. Low Earth orbit eliminates that latency penalty. It also means destroying a few satellites does not take down the network. Redundancy is architectural rather than incidental. Ukraine's encounter with Starlink began in a moment of acute crisis. On February 26, 2022, 2 days after the full-scale invasion, Elon Musk announced via social media that Starlink service had been activated over Ukraine, responding to a direct public appeal from Ukraine's Minister of Digital Transformation, Mikhailo Fedorov. The initial batch of terminals arrived within days, airlifted by cargo flights. What followed was not a planned military integration. It was improvisation at extraordinary speed. The Ukrainian military's existing communications infrastructure had been built around assumptions that no longer held. Fiber optic links between command nodes were severed in the opening strikes. Cellular towers in contested areas went dark. Military radio networks, always vulnerable to direction finding and jamming, became even more dangerous to operate in the dense electronic warfare environment Russian forces brought to the battlefield. Ukrainian units were operating with communications that were simultaneously being degraded and hunted. Starlink filled the gap, but calling it a communications replacement understates the transformation. The terminals unlocked something Ukrainian planners had not fully anticipated: a genuinely distributed command and control architecture across a front line stretching hundreds of kilometers, with no single physical spine that could be cut. Company-level units that might previously have depended on a single radio link to battalion headquarters could now maintain independent data connections. That changed how orders moved, how sensor data moved, and critically, how strike coordination moved. The drone dimension is where the operational impact became most visible. By mid-2022, Ukraine had established the pattern that would define its tactical approach for years: small first-person view drones serving as both reconnaissance and strike platforms, controlled by operators who might be a kilometer or more behind the forward edge, relaying position data through Starlink connections that suffered none of the range limitations of standard radio control links. Artillery and mortar fire grew faster and more precise because the loop connecting a drone observer to a fire direction center to a gun crew could run over a broadband data channel rather than voice radio. The time from target identification to first round compressed. Russian tank crews and artillery positions that had operated with some impunity behind terrain found themselves being tracked and engaged by units they could not locate. By the fall of 2022, Reporting from multiple defense-oriented outlets, later confirmed by Ukrainian officials, indicated that Starlink terminals had reached the tens of thousands in Ukrainian military use. SpaceX acknowledged donating a significant portion of those terminals and waiving service fees for a substantial share of Ukrainian government usage. The exact figures shifted over time and were reported inconsistently across sources, so any single number should be treated as approximate rather than definitive. What is not in dispute is the scale. Starlink had become, by the assessment of multiple independent analysts and Ukrainian commanders themselves, the backbone of military communications across the entire contact zone. The Russian military's response went through recognizable stages. The first was jamming. Russian electronic warfare units deployed systems designed to suppress GPS signals and interfere with satellite communications uplinks. These efforts had measurable effects on older military hardware and on cheap commercial quadcopters that depended on GPS for position hold. Against Starlink specifically, the results were more mixed. SpaceX issued a series of firmware updates across 2022 and into 2023 that reportedly improved the system's ability to maintain links under interference conditions. One specific adaptation noted in technical commentary was a narrower, more directional antenna beam that made it harder for a ground-based jammer to overpower the satellite uplink. Musk claimed publicly that Russian jamming efforts were neutralized within hours through software changes. Independent analysts treated those claims with appropriate skepticism, but the operational record, Starlink remained functional as a network across years of conflict, suggests the system showed meaningful resilience that standard military communications often do not. The second stage was physical interdiction. Russian strike missions targeted Ukrainian command nodes and communications infrastructure. Starlink terminals, being small, portable, and numerous, presented a challenging targeting problem. Destroying a single fiber relay station takes out a node serving an area. Destroying a single Starlink dish takes out one terminal in a network of tens of thousands. Replacement terminals arrived continuously, donated by SpaceX and funded through Western government arrangements, and the network as a whole kept functioning. The third stage revealed a complication that would grow in significance. By 2023 and into 2024, reporting from multiple sources indicated Russian forces had begun acquiring Starlink terminals themselves, routing them through third-party intermediaries in countries that maintained commercial access to the service. The mechanism was straightforward. SpaceX sold terminals commercially in countries not party to the conflict. Those terminals were moved through legal gray zones or outright sanctions evasion into Russian-controlled territory. Once activated, a Starlink terminal works the same regardless of who is holding it. This created an operationally and politically awkward situation. Terminals nominally provided to sustain Ukrainian communications were, in some cases, being used by the adversary. Figures for Russian terminal use have been reported inconsistently and should not be treated as authoritative, without noting that the sources have interests in the claims. What is not disputed is that the problem was real, documented, and ultimately drew a direct response from SpaceX. The most consequential episode in this regard involves a specific technical countermeasure with direct battlefield consequences. By late 2025 and into early 2026, Ukrainian intelligence and frontline technical observers were tracking evidence that Russian strike drones were utilizing Starlink terminals for navigation or communications in some capacity. A terminal mounted near a Russian drone control position or integrated into a drone's relay chain provided high-bandwidth communications that either guided the drone or relayed its sensor data. The speed profile of the terminal's movement became the tell. A terminal moving at highway speeds is probably in a vehicle. A terminal moving above 75 to 90 kilometers per hour, the figures cited in Ukrainian reporting, suggested use connected to airborne platforms. Ukraine shared this evidence with SpaceX. The company's response, reported in early 2026, was the implementation of a velocity-based restriction, terminals flagged as moving above a threshold speed, in contexts suggesting airborne use, would have their service degraded or suspended automatically. A senior Ukrainian military official described the outcome in carefully measured terms. The restriction reduced the effectiveness of Russian strike drone operations by a reported 20 to 40%. That range is deliberately imprecise, reflecting uncertainty in battlefield assessment, but the directional claim that the speed gating had a meaningful negative effect was treated as credible by independent analysts tracking the conflict. This episode is analytically significant in a way that extends beyond its immediate battlefield effect. SpaceX, a private company, made a technical modification to a commercial service in direct response to evidence provided by one party to an active armed conflict, with the effect of degrading the other party's military operations. That is a different kind of action from simply providing communications to one side. It is closer to an active technical intervention in the conflict's electronic dimension, made without a formal treaty framework governing such decisions, without international legal precedent specifically applicable to the scenario, and with real and measurable effects on combat outcomes. The governance implications remain largely unresolved. A separate and earlier controversy illuminated a different dimension of the same governance problem. In late 2022, reporting emerged, later elaborated in Walter Isaacson's biography of Musk, that SpaceX had not extended Starlink coverage to a zone where Ukrainian naval drones were attempting an operation against Russian naval assets at Sevastopol. The account, as reconstructed from multiple sourcing chains, described Ukrainian operators losing connectivity as their drones approached the target area, with the gap in coverage apparently a deliberate decision by SpaceX based on concerns about escalation risk in the Crimean context. The account was disputed in significant ways. Ukrainian officials challenged elements of the reconstruction. Musk offered his own characterization that differed from Isaacson's in important respects. What remained after the dispute was a structural observation that neither side contested, a decision by a private American company about the geographic coverage of a commercial satellite service had directly intersected with a military operation, and the operator of that service had exercised judgment with strategic consequences. Whether that judgment was correct is a separate question from the observation that it was made, and that nothing in existing legal frameworks clearly governed how it should be made. These episodes crystallized a concern that military and defense policy communities had been circling since early in the war. Traditional military communications infrastructure operates within a chain of command. It is built and governed by the military or by contractors operating under military authority and contract terms that specify what can and cannot be done with the service. Starlink is none of those things. Its service agreement is commercial. Its coverage decisions, technical configurations, and service modifications are made by company management, subject to U.S. export controls and sanctions law, but not to the same command authority that governs military communications. A brigade commander relying on Starlink for command and control is relying on infrastructure whose continued provision depends in part on the business judgment of a private executive. Ukrainian military communications planners acknowledged this vulnerability. Reporting from 2023 and 2024 indicated explicit efforts to reduce single-point dependence on Starlink by integrating it alongside legacy military radio systems, surviving civilian fiber, and other commercial satellite services. The goal was resilience through diversity, no single pathway able to take down critical links. Starlink remained dominant in that ecosystem, but the intellectual acknowledgement that it required redundancy represented doctrinal adaptation to the vulnerability the system's commercial nature introduced. From a signals intelligence perspective, Starlink terminals created a location problem for Ukrainian forces that Russian electronic warfare units reportedly tried to exploit. A terminal transmitting produces a radio frequency signature. The phased array antenna that makes Starlink terminals compact is also directional, which complicates direction finding compared to an omnidirectional emitter, but it does transmit, and that transmission is in principle detectable. Reports from the conflict zone suggested Russian strike missions against Ukrainian command posts were sometimes cued by detection of Starlink terminal emissions, a technique that echoes Cold War practice of hunting command nodes by their radio traffic, now applied to satellite uplinks. Ukrainian forces reportedly adapted by transmitting in bursts rather than continuously, relocating terminals after extended operation in fixed positions, and using terrain masking to obstruct uplink detection. These practices are not confirmed in official sources, but the behavioral pattern is consistent with awareness that active terminals could be located. One operational dimension often underemphasized is Starlink's role in civilian continuity. Military and civilian communications infrastructure in Ukraine are not neatly separable. Territory under Ukrainian government control maintained functioning civil society, hospitals, utility management, emergency services, partly because Starlink coverage remained available when terrestrial infrastructure was struck. This civilian use had indirect military value. It maintained the societal stability and governmental function that Ukraine's war effort depended on. It also meant that any disruption to the service, from a jamming campaign, a SpaceX operational decision, or a technical outage, would be immediately visible in humanitarian impact, creating a form of accountability for service continuity that purely military communications do not face. A company whose network was simultaneously providing frontline military communications and keeping hospitals online could not make decisions about that service without those decisions having humanitarian as well as military dimensions. Looking at the record from 2022 through early 2026, several things can be stated with reasonable confidence. Low Earth orbit broadband at scale creates a qualitatively different communications environment for land forces than anything previously available at that cost and level of portability. The combination of high bandwidth, low latency, small terminal size, rapid deployment, and architectural resilience against single-point failures mapped directly onto the distributed, sensor-intensive style of warfare Ukraine prosecuted. The capability arrived at the right moment and integrated with drone-centric tactics that depended on exactly those characteristics. Starlink's resilience to jamming was real, but was not a permanent physical immunity. It was the product of ongoing technical competition. SpaceX investing in software and hardware improvements to maintain that resilience against an adversary actively trying to degrade it. Other satellite systems without similar developmental investment and organizational agility might not have fared as well in that environment. The governance questions will outlast this conflict. Commercial satellite networks with military-scale utility and active combat zones expose a structural gap in the international legal and policy frameworks governing armed conflict. The laws of armed conflict address state actors and their belligerent activities. They do not clearly address what obligations a private satellite operator carries when its commercial service becomes militarily decisive for one belligerent, or what rights an opposing belligerent has to target ground terminals or attempt technical suppression of a commercial satellite network. These are not hypothetical questions for future planners. Every major military alliance and several non-aligned states are now studying the Ukraine case because their own operational planning assumes access to commercial low Earth orbit satellite communications. The framework for governing that access, and for understanding the vulnerabilities it introduces, remains unfinished. The small white dish zip-tied to a sandbag wall did not arrive in Ukraine as a weapon. It arrived as a communications terminal, the kind of device a ship at sea or a rural homeowner might use for internet access. What the Ukraine war demonstrated was that at sufficient scale and reliability in a conflict environment where traditional communications infrastructure is systematically attacked, a commercial broadband satellite network can become something that shapes the character of the fighting itself. The terminals that coordinated artillery fire, that kept drone operators connected to their aircraft, that maintained data links between dispersed command nodes along a front of several hundred kilometers, became so embedded in Ukrainian military operations that the conflict's conduct was materially different for their presence. The satellite constellation that began as a commercial venture to provide global internet access ended up demonstrating in 4 years of high-intensity warfare that the distinction between commercial infrastructure and military infrastructure had become, in the operational environment of modern conflict, effectively meaningless. Whatever framework emerges from that recognition will be among the more consequential military policy developments of the decade.